Hello, gentlemen. So today what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about budgeting. We're not going to go into too much detail about budgeting as about how much you should select for a certain amount, but we're just talking about how you can determine how much income you have, what are your expenses, and how to balance that to create a budget. So we're going to talk about this, just the basic steps for creating a budget. The first thing you need to do is decide on a time period. Now, it's difficult to budget too far in advance, but some time periods might be a little short. You could budget by the week, the fortnight, or for an entire month. Any of those are pretty feasible. Now, if you try to go beyond a month, then it gets a little unrealistic. Most people budget depending on how they get paid. So if you get paid fortnightly, then you make a budget that's based on fortnightly periods, okay? But you can change that to suit. Be careful in the problems, though. They're definitely going to give you a time period. Second, you're going to list all income for that period. So again, if you get paid fortnightly and you decide to make a fortnightly budget, then any income you have from that fortnightly period you would list here. Now, income doesn't just mean salary. You could also be getting income from investments. You might have a part-time job. You might be getting an allowance. So there might be other monies that come in that you should list here. Make sure that you're listing every possible source of income for that period. Then, third, you want to list all expenses for that period. Now, this could get a little funny because most of your bills, if you were running a household, your electric bill, etc., would come in monthly. So if you're doing it as monthly, then you need to accommodate that by doing a little math, okay? So for example, let's say we have an electric bill of $100 per month, but we're gonna do it fortnightly. So what we know is that we could just take $100 times 12 months to get the yearly total. And then we would simply divide that by 26 fortnights to get us how much it would be per fortnight. Or if you were doing weekly, you could do it divided by 52, etc. Or if, say, for example, you knew that in 1 year you had to pay life insurance of $1,200, you could divide that $1,200 by 12 to find out the monthly, or by 26 to find out the fortnightly, etc. So some things are going to have to be broken down into smaller pieces so that you can then see how much each particular expense is going to give you during your preferred period for budgeting. Okay. Step 4. Now what we want to do is we want to calculate the total for each of those. So the total income and expenses. Now these are separate. Do them separately into two different totals. So, right? 2 totals. Don't worry about putting them together yet. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay? So we've calculated all of our income, all of our expenses. Now we have a total for both of those, so we know what we need to spend during that period. Now what we're going to do is something called balance the budget. And it's really important that you understand that this word balance is a part of the budgeting language, okay? And we need to balance the budget by simply taking our income minus our expenses. right? So it's just as simple as taking those two total columns that you just created and subtracting them. Make sure you subtract them in the right order, right? And you've got to be careful because you need to see, is this, when you do the subtraction, is it positive or negative? If it's positive, great, you have money left over at the end of the year. You might consider putting that into savings or maybe blow it on something fun. But if it's negative, then that means you're going to have to go back and look at some of your expenses and see if there's some expense you can cut to kind of trim down until you get to the money that you have. Now, some are fixed or expenses that you can't really mess with, so essential living costs such as rent, electricity, but anything that's discretionary, then those are the things that you can change. So we need to talk about those. So fixed expenses. So that's like rent, utilities, things you can't go without. You can't change those. They're not going to vary very much over time. But then we have what's called discretionary expenses or discretionary spending. Not even usually called expenses because these are things that you choose to spend money on, such as entertainment, or clothing. Now, I'm not saying that you can't get by without clothing, but you could buy less of it or you could buy something less expensive, right? So the discretionary spending is where you're going to find a little wiggle room if you're going over your budget. Okay? Now we're going to do some examples where we're going to be balancing and creating some budgets and answering some questions about whether or not we think that how we could change a budget to make it fit this situation, and we will do those in class together. Thanks so much, guys. See you tomorrow.